everyone for your patience and welcome to the 138th workshop in the CPR-CSH Urban Workshop Series. We're very happy today to welcome Sushmita Pati, who is Assistant Professor in Political Science at the National Law School of India University at Bangalore. Uh, Sushmita's work is, we've all been following it for a while now. And we're particularly excited that after some hits and misses, we've managed to get her on the workshop today. She's going to speak, as you know, about rent regulation and the career of an urban village. I will not repeat and read from the abstract, which which is a sort of a pointless exercise, since all of you would have definitely seen and been through what she's presented. But I'll hand over directly to Sushmita. Just on the housekeeping front, Sushmita, you have about 45 minutes to speak. Less is good, more is not. If you want to break it up into a couple of parts, just so that the audience can engage given the online format, that's fine as well. We will be taking questions. The Q&A box is open to you. You can put your questions in the Q&A box. You can also put it in the chat box. So we're not particularly, sort of very rule bound by those things. Also, as you know, from those of you who've attended our webinars before, once Sushmita has presented, if time permits, we will also sort of open the floor for people to ask questions, which in this webinar format means that that the voice is we can open up the voice for you to actually ask your question yourself. So we hope that we can have a very interactive session, and I'll hand over to you, Sushmita. Thank you so much once again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mukta, for the warm welcome. Also, thanks, Remy and Aprajita, for making sure this happens and inviting me here. So this is a larger part. This is a part of the larger work that I've done in terms of the urban village. And what I do is that I look at two urban villages, which is Munika and Shapujat, both of which exist in the middle of a bustling upper middle class localities of South Delhi. In the book, I trace their journeys from being villages with agrarian pastoral economy in the 50s and the 40s, all the way to now when they become urban villages, right in the middle of an urban economy. I trace how these two villages, both dominated by the Jats, a historically landed community, and how they have responded to their changing social relationship with land. In doing this, in the entire book, I argue how rent becomes an important way of negotiating their terms in the city. Rent, unlike capital, is defined by possession. Unlike capital, especially finance capital, that is defined by quick buying and selling, which sort of effaces the idea of ownership, rent continues to function and gets defined by very thick notions of ownership. Rent is therefore created and maintained by through control. The larger argument I make in the book is that rent has different ways of shaping the city than capital. And the social life of rent then gets translated into claims of being indigenous, into anger and hurt towards the state for having mistreated them, but one that also consolidate community networks very, very differently. So while urban scholarship has paid a lot of attention to capital through closely looking at these villages, I am making an argument that rent has deployed very different ways of accumulation. And it also comes to life through very different negotiations and affects. Right? Just to give you a backdrop of what these urban villages are and what I'm talking about, many of you are already familiar, but many of you probably are not. Urban villages come into existence in the backdrop of the master plan, Delhi Master Plan 1962. So this is a time when India has just gotten its independence. Delhi has become the capital of a post-colonial nation. So this is a time when there's a lot of upheaval in the city in terms of construction, making new offices, making new secretariats, right? So what is immediately needed is vast plots of land, right? So that is when, say, DDA begins acquiring a huge amount of land, which has been very, very well documented in Ravi Sundaram's book, in Avadindra Sharan's work as well. But what's interesting about this kind of land acquisition, which I'm looking at, is the curious method they deploy, which is that they acquire the agricultural land of these villages, but they leave the residential area of these villages untouched, right? So as a result, what happens in these 50, 60 years, the agricultural land that was once theirs transforms itself into what we today know as South Delhi, right? Which we know as, like, the very expensive upper middle class localities, into shopping malls, into private all kinds of amenities, into flyovers. But their residential villages sort of remain stuck in time, right? What is happening here is that there was no cohesive planning that happened for them. And it is almost to say as if the state forgot these villages. The state also the DDA issued a circular in the year 1963 that these villages are exempt from building bylaws, which is that they do not need to follow any plans or any laws in terms of building their property, right, or building their villages. So as we can see, that these villages then developed in the shadows of the state. With no agriculture and some compensation money, they began to plunge into new businesses that the city threw up opportunities for. So a lot of them got into construction, some of them got into transportation, some of them got into taxi and bus, blue line bus kind of a business. So that's the broad way in which they sort of plunge into the kind of opportunities that get thrown at them, and that's the subject of another chapter that I look at. This is precisely what I'm talking about. So as you see, this is what Delhi's urban villages would at this point look like. They're very, very close to really, really upmarket localities and upmarket spaces in Delhi, right? Right. So, but what also emerged in the shadows of the state is also an organization of an economic and social system that was entirely vernacular, based on kin networks. So as they were responding to the city and the opportunities that was being thrown at them, they were also sort of using their resources, using their understandings of how the world works. They also build their own internal dynamic structures, which sort of became their institutions through which they would respond to the city. And this economic and social system is at the same time both affective but also at the same time promotes accumulation. And it is a system, and these institutions also then promote the system of the ways of control by the community. So I also speak of how panchayats become that kind of institution where they both regulate the economic aspect of it, as well as the social aspect of them being villagers in a city, right? So this negotiation that is happening between the city and the village takes several forms, and this conflict that I'm talking about in terms of rent and capital. It takes the form of suspicion of the city dwellers. That's one. It also takes the form of suspicion towards finance capital. It also takes the form of suspicion towards the state. So in this particular talk, I would precisely talk about the state aspect of it. So what I mean by vernacular form of capitalism is that these villages is that the localized channels of investing, financing, and controlling economic structures is done through categories of control which find expression in rent, in the fact that they collectively own a resource that is priceless, that is urban land. So these two villages that I speak of, Munirka and Shahpujat, are both products of these conflict. In the light of the exemption from building bylaws, the 1963 circular that I'm talking about, Munirka developed into a hub of students with pigeonhole one-room sets. So basically, this is a village which, and there are several villages like Munirka which are jam-packed with what you call as one-room sets. So what you have is basically lots of tiny pigeonhole sets, which has one room, one bathroom, and one kitchen. So it's mainly targeted at younger, lower middle class population, migrants who come to the city for the first time. So this is basically, so if I think many of us who've come to Delhi would first have had the experience of living in one of these places and then moving out to other places, right? And I think Mukta talks about them as arrival spaces. So that's these are many a times the first places where you arrive at in the city as a migrant. And Shahpur Jat, on the other hand, emerges as an important node in the garment chain. So it becomes home to several units or karkhana where garments are produced, are manufactured, and after as time developed, they also. Shahpur Jat also evolved as a space for boutiques. So on the outer side, you have a lot of showrooms and fashion designer concept stores, and on the inside are these small, tiny karkhana units, which are basically manufacturing these garments. For the purposes of this chapter, I would jump straight into my third chapter, which frames this conflict to the question of regulation, especially post-2000s. With the economy liberalizing in the 1990s, Delhi witnessed a growth in the service-led economy, which brought both new businesses as well as new migrants in the city, which transformed these villages radically. Those of you, again, who followed Mukta's work would know what I'm talking about. Munirka village transformed into a space of cheap renting accommodations. On the other hand, Shahpur Jat transformed into a space for garment manufacturing unit, as I was saying. By the 2000s, so as these economies sort of stabilize and they become more and more popular, the courtyards begin to disappear from both these villages, and so do the baithaks. Baithaks are these communal spaces where men would sit and talk and smoke hookah. Anything that was considered wastage of space has been done away with rebuilding of these houses. Munirka had one unnamed gumbad or tomb from the medieval period, but in the race to construct, it was over a period of time razed to the ground. The Thanewala Gumbad in Shahpur Jat, a more prominent historical site recognized by the Archaeological Survey of India, has often been the reason for notices being served because of various ways in which encroachment happens into that protected monument. As Shahpur Jat become more prominent in the garment chain, especially earning a repute of being the go-to place for Delhi wedding outfits, its property value continued to burgeon. A unit that could be rented for rupees 10,000 in the year 2000 in Shahpur Jat, by 2005, the rent had risen to rupees 25,000. The commercial plots have also been halved to accommodate more tenants. That was one of the easiest way in which the local inhabitants could double their income. Splitting one commercial unit into two automatically brought in much higher volumes of rent without necessarily significantly cutting down on the rent amount. Lalita, a lady I met in Shahpur Jat, who's a landlady, she speaks proudly of the number of innovations she introduced to increase rents over time. Constructing basements, erecting partitions, changing the entrances. Dharampal Panwar's grandfather also built this house number 160 in 1907. It still stands with its traditional arches and old-fashioned wooden doors in a narrow lane in Shahpur Jat, which is filled with a constant din of swing machines from neighboring houses. A notice hangs by the main door of Dharampal's house, and it reads, "This is a heritage property. This property was built during the Mughal emperor rule." Along with another notice which stating the requirement for a master tailor, a board hangs outside the door which reads, "Only interested in giving to foreigners for rent." The term Mughal in the first notice stands merely as a marker of the house being old rather than denoting an authentic timeline. Wanting to promote this particular house as a heritage property, Dharampal wanted to increase the valuation of the building by getting foreigner tenants who might want to spruce it up and turn it into an exotic boutique. Like Lalita and Dhampal, several of them think of themselves as individuated economic actors who were capable of innovation, who could take supposed risks. Their risk-taking abilities and innovative capacities uh, gives them a self-perception of being entrepreneurs. That is someone with a sense of endeavor, adventure, and ability in control of uncertainties. Though all of them operate in the domain of ground rent, their self-imagination defies that association. Rent minimizes risk, the hallmark of finance capital. Arjun Appadurai makes an important observation that with finance capital, the spirit of capitalism has moved away from being embodied in an austere Protestant Christian who found virtue in hard work to a far more maverick, adventurous, risk-taking figure. It is not surprising then that these several landlords want to think of themselves as entrepreneurs, as risk-taking individuals. Many would not want to identify with the rentier alone, a rustic, idle villager who does nothing apart from rebuilding his property. Rent provides a world where there are no successes or failures. But living in the world defined by capital, which celebrates self-made men, risk-taking individuals, many landlords too see themselves in that image. And yet, although they do distinguish themselves from the rest, they are beneficiaries of the same system, which is created by uniform communal possession of a resource, right? And in here, what I mean by a uniform communal possession of resource is the one-room set, or say the karkhana, which are all uniform, no matter which one you're looking at. So they're more or less the same kind of property, right? So they're not very differential. So which is and the rates, the property, so the rental rates also then are then uniform at a more or less basic level, right? Risk also takes up different kind of meanings. Rajkamal Rathi from Munirka quit his Delhi police job to become a builder. He only builds in urban villages, however. In a regularized colony, Rajkamal claims, one would have to pay rupees 15 lakhs to just get all kinds of clearances, none of which is required for urban villages. When I spoke to him, he did not seem to have any qualms regarding the unauthorized status of his constructions. When I asked him how they negotiated the Lal Dora limits as builders, Lal Dora is the extent of the urban village periphery, right? He told me almost casually, sab risk par chal raha hai. Everything is running on risk. The risk which Rajkamal refers to is one that does not stem from ups and downs of the market, but the state. The risk he refers to is with respect to the risk of demolition of unauthorized construction. And the only way in which this risk is mitigated is by expressions of collective power. Right? This is where I'm constantly talking of the need for having that kind of collectivity, that sort of control, that sort of ownership, which also then melds with very affective notions of belongingness in a city, how as being indigenous community within within a city like Delhi, and how the state has mistreated them over a period of years. So that then becomes the affective discourse within these institutions and spaces, right? So then coming to demolitions and the state, the careers of cities have historically been made possible through demolitions, and one can very easily tell a story of any city through history of its demolitions. And Delhi's story is no different. The massive demolition drives around the Yamuna Pushta squatter settlements in 2004, in preparation of 2010 Commonwealth Games, is one of the examples in this regard. As evident in the MC Mehta versus Union of India case in 2006, which argued, which I'm sure all of you know, the MC Mehta, the Supreme Court ordered under this case that all unauthorized property in Delhi needs to be demolished, right, or needs to be sealed, not demolished as such, right? So as evident in the MC Mehta case as well, demolitions have for the long been the most accepted method of the state for regulating spaces. By raising a built structure to the ground, the space is freed up to rebuild as per law. It is also a way of penalizing the ones who break the law. But demolitions, when looked at closely, tell us something vital about the relationship between governance, citizenship, and political power. And they are, in fact, an important field of studying constitution of these interrelationship. There are reasons why orders like that of MC Mehta's have created immense stir, but have seldom succeeded. The only massive demolition drive that took place in Munirka was in 1985. This demolition became increasingly controversial, and it splashed all over media, including international media, for other reasons. So much so that even the Union Minister of Urban Development at the time, Abdul Ghaffur, had to field questions regarding the ministry's legitimacy and rehabilitation policy in the lower house of the Indian Parliament. A hapless Mr. Ghaffur responded that despite repeated efforts of demolitions, unauthorized constructions keep coming up again and again, and that he's unable to do much about it. This statement of the urban development minister that betrays his sense of helplessness probably encompasses the story of demolition drives in India. More often than not, they are rendered useless, especially I'm talking more in the case of unauthorized colonies, not so much about the slums. The slums have, of course, witnessed a very different kind of a trajectory. More often than not, they are rendered useless by new informal settlements that crop up almost immediately after. Demolition drives have not been unknown to the city of Delhi. We have seen examples of massive demolition drives, like I was talking about. In the contemporary cases of demolitions in Munirka and Shapujat that I witnessed, demolitions have begun to look very different. They were not drives; they were more individuated in nature. Rambir Singh in his 70s can be found sitting outside his massive commercial property of 5 floors in Shapujat, smoking his hookah on most days. While it is partly used for residential purposes, several floors of the building are also let out to startups, firms, and chartered accountant offices. Although the building is located along a commercial road, Rambir Singh claims that they do not pay any house tax or conversion charge. Yahan koi nahi dekhta, he says. Nobody looks here. On asking him about the threat of MCD wanting to demolish his property, he says nonchalantly, यहाँ कोई कभी भी किसी को कुछ तोड़ने नहीं देता. अगर कभी ऐसी नौबत आ जाए तो पूरा गांव साथ में खड़ा हो जाता है. Nobody ever lets anyone break anything here. If such a situation crops up, then the entire village comes together. Singh's comment is reminiscent of an incident in 1997 when demolitions ordered by the then South Delhi Deputy Municipal Commissioner Chetan Sanghi led the residents of Shapujat to congregate outside the MCD office with sticks and rods. Today, demolitions in these villages are very silent. For the lower bureaucracy in charge of demolitions, who are usually in cahoots with the MCD councillors, who are local politicians, proof of demolition effectively translates into breaking a few sections that can be repaired easily. The South Delhi Municipal Corporation has a significant number of Jats in hugely influential positions, many of whom own property in such disputed urban villages. A complex system that involves the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, the local councillor, and the clout that these villages enjoy determines the nature of the demolitions. It might even be said that the vague laws and rules that the state once deliberately maintained do not seem to be working in the favor of the state anymore. The state is not unaware of all this. It realizes that demolitions are a rather ineffective way of ensuring compliance. Not only do the unauthorized structures return, demolitions also add a huge expense to the state's exchequer. The MC Mehta judgment that we're talking about that ordered the shutting down of each and every unauthorized construction in Delhi, leading to a major upheaval, exposed the sheer impracticability of such a policy. On the one hand, demolitions have not solved the problems of unauthorized construction, and on the other, their unauthorized status then precludes the state from staking claim in the share of the revenue pie. Increasingly now, this is the shift that I'm trying to mark in the work that I do, is that the state has been now attempting to tame these villages, and increasingly through more and more rules and regulations, this circular, that notice. The Mini Master Plan 1985 had suggested that the earlier privileges that were accorded to these villages as exemptions to building bylaws must end, and that building plans have to be sanctioned by either the DDA or the MCD. After two editions of Delhi Master Plan, which refused to say anything concrete about urban villages, the Delhi Master Plan 2021 ruled that urban villages would be governed by special regulations like the walled city, while leaving immense scope for authorities yet again. And what the new master plan in Delhi 2041 is going to do is something that we are yet to see, because the draft on urban villages is not out, as Mukta would also would tell you. Right, give me a second.
Sushmita,
Yeah,
just interrupting, sorry to say, do you have more slides? Or
I don't have too many, I just have two more.
Oh, okay.
Is there a reason you're asking?
No. I'm just wondering whether the slides are not moving
No.
you're not moving them, or because you're speaking on one slide.
No, I'm just speaking as in, this is just to give you a sense of what the.
Fine.
In fact, yeah, I can. So this, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Right. So this is exactly, if you see this map, it will tell you as to how these villages have sort of now look like. This is Shapujat on the left, this is Munika on the right, and you would see how these villages have come to now. The dots, the circle the dots are the residential area of the village, and the ones which are in squares and the ones which are in vertical lines, they represent the city and the urban development that's around them. Yeah, thank you. Actually, you reminded me. I sort of forgot to change the slide. Yeah, I'm sorry. Right. So furthermore, these digitized land records have been one of the core mandates of the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Regeneration Program. The final step of this transformation, however, came in the year 2011 in the form of a rejoinder to the circular of 1963. So if you remember, the 1963 circular actually gave the exemption from building bylaws. This rejoinder comes in and makes a clarification that that the exemptions given to the villages were only applicable to rural villages and not to urban ones. In this version of the state's articulation, the exemption never existed at all. The 2001 circular, by ending all ambiguity over the Lal Dora for urban villages, now staked a claim on the new kinds of value increasingly embedded in these villages. What had happened, in effect, was that the post-colonial state had finally taken cognizance of these spaces as ones of value, and it now needed to organize them into grids of property and taxation. By making these villages equivalent to unauthorized colonies, the administration attempted to end the ambiguity over the status of Lal Dora areas and make these villages subject to law. From a time when it turned a blind eye to the fluidity of land records and the illegalities that surrounded land ownership in Lal Dora areas, the state now attempted to wrest control over these spaces and constantly striving to bring in new regulations. In doing so, it is trying to generate a newer kind of formalized documentation through circulars and directives. Regulations have therefore found a new life in these villages. We are also seeing a new interest in regularization from the state. Right? Regularization of these properties which are not necessarily acknowledged as formal titles. But unlike other unauthorized colonies, urban villages look at the promises of regularization with suspicion. They have lived outside the state's purview for long and have figured out networks that have allowed them to create a vernacular economic system. They are well aware that regularization would subject them to state regulations, various taxations, and charges, as well as the market. The contradiction, therefore, is this, that the state that once forgot these villages are allowed these illegible forms of ownerships to proliferate, now increasingly intends to bring them into the fold of regulation. The villages, on the other hand, which have discovered the advantages of being unregulated, want to continue outside the gaze of the state. While the unauthorized colonies have been clamoring for regularization, these villages have never really responded to such promises by the state. Not new to rent on the basis of social capital, this community, as owners of urban real estate, now has to figure out how it can protect its own interests, social and economic. The tussle between the state and the villagers is mediated through various government directives, notices, court cases, demolitions, and the gaps and contestations they create. And the contentious Laldora has, in effect, become the frontier between the state and the community. So, right. So, as I was saying, that it's also becoming increasingly important for the state to now regularize, also because it would then enable the state to then sink its teeth into the revenue pie that these villages are possibly generating. Understandably, for a cash-strapped South Delhi Municipal Corporation, property tax, circle rates, conversion charges from these villages would be an important source of revenue. For ruling government of the capital as well, meeting the long-standing demands of regularization of unauthorized colonies brings in electoral gains. With regularization, however, the state could formally be coming around to accepting that a city like Delhi will be inhabited by a far different aesthetic than what the Ford Foundation had conceptualized with the Delhi Master Plan. How much time do I have?
You have another 13, 14 minutes. You
Okay.
have 4:30.
Thanks. Right. So even as the state is possibly moving from demolitions to regularization as a method of staking claims in these unmapped localities, regularization, as I'm saying, is continues to be looked upon as with suspicion. The villages, as a result, continue to hold on to the Lal Dora as a source of and claims of legitimacy. They often complain that the Lal Dora should have been extended like it was for rural villages. They attempt to make the villages fall in line, follow building bylaws, and pay taxes is only met with skepticism and defiance. Anger on the grounds of low compensation that they received for their lands in the 1950s and 60s, and poor infrastructure is used to validate some of this non-compliance. Anger and a feeling of injustice are therefore at the heart of the villagers' relationship with the state. But there is more than anger at play. The rejection of modern property regimes dominated by regulation and clear land titles is central to this rent economy. While residents of unauthorized colonies feel vulnerable about the status of their property, the villagers seem to have learned that the label of illegal does not threaten the security of their ownerships, and in fact allows them to have a communal basis of maintaining that kind of a system. On the other hand, regularization would subject them to the state through a regime of taxation and laws and need them to produce papers and documents to prove their possessions of property. It will also subject them to laws and regulations that may weaken the communal control over the real estate markets in such places. Property is not merely a claim to right to a piece of land. Property rights are also a claim of being citizens. And as standard liberal political theory would talk about protection of life, liberty, and property, going back to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, would constantly speak of property as the basis of that kind of citizenship and relationship with the state. In the case of fuzzy property regime, what kind of citizens does it go on to produce? When slum dwellers ask for regularization of the slums, it is fundamentally a claim of citizenship that they make. In the case of these two urban villages that we're looking at, what we come across is a form of an alternate system, a parallel logic of governance by non-state actors that come into existence in the cracks of governance and law. It also begets the question of political authority. If property and citizenship constitute political authority as much as political authority constitutes property and citizenship, then it becomes an important matter to ask, how does the state figure here? Christian Lund's work, in which he argues how production and rearrangement of property and citizenship have consolidated, challenged, and even fragmented political authority. But instead of understanding the state simply as weak and fragile, Lund argues it would be productive to understand a far more complex relationship between political authority and alternative claims over political rights. Hurt and anger, as we were talking about, historically have been powerful modes of political organization. The particular discourse of hurt that is used by these villagers have been an important affect through which they relate to the city. It has done two things. It evokes the greater injustice done to the villages in the name of development and becomes the basis of an appeal for the state to continue with exemptions that were earlier available to them. Anger and hurt, therefore, also go on to become the affect that constitute the villagers as a community in opposition to the urban citizens. The anguish and hurt are real. The feeling that they have been shortchanged by the state with regard to compensation money is a living wound. When they could have been owners of prime property in Delhi, they are instead reduced to protecting a few buildings in and around the village. But then that anguish and hurt is also to some extent instrumentally deployed to keep the exemptions going. The discourse has clearly witnessed a shift as real estate has become a far more lucrative option than agriculture. But one thing that has stayed constant is the claim of being different from city people. The accusation that Delhi has accorded them stepmotherly treatment is a constant. Speaking of themselves as bhole bhale or simple gullible people at the time of land acquisition, the lament of having had very little bargaining power comes up again and again. The slow disappearance of cattle from their environment generates a deep sense of loss for the pure, unadulterated worlds that they imagine. This account of the state's injustice is still alive in the collective memory of their villages, and conversations often lead to it. Though often exaggerated, these memories hark back to the originary injustice meted out to the naive and gullible villagers in the face of the powerful law. It is not surprising, therefore, that in none of the protests and petitions, the rancor has been directed at has never been directed at clarifying property ownerships in the Lardora or to digitize or formalize land ownership. They may have mastered their own version of the art of not being governed, and I'm referring to James Scott's work, where he's talking about this communities in the highlands of Indonesia, which has managed to skirt the purview of the state. But so it may have mastered its own way of the art of not being governed, but then it does not quite reflect back to the same pristine community of people untouched that James Scott talks about, untouched both by state and capital. They may have learned to keep the state at bay, but they're absolutely clued into the webs of capital. The 1990s economic reforms have changed how these villagers and residents relate to the city and the state. As these villages keep reinventing themselves, so does the discourse of anger and belongingness to the city. The struggle is now over the question of exemption. Exemption means far more to the villagers than just administrative relief now. It is also a struggle over identity, over local control, and a stake in the ever-changing life of the city. Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot to change the. I constantly keep getting flustered between the screen and the paper. And sorry, yeah.
All right, no worries. So we do have, I think, a couple of questions, and thank you, Sushmita, for that. And I'm just going to ask Manish to ask. Manish, do you want to ask your own question? And then I'll move to the next. I've just permitted talking for you.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Maybe that.
Yes. That'll be great.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Sushmita. This was, and like for me, it was absolutely lovely to see this, and I'm looking forward to the book also, given that long back we had a conversation about this at CPR when you were in the earlier stages of your research. So it's really nice to see how this has come out. My question goes back to DDA's 1963 circular and the earlier part of your presentation. Were you able to find out in your digging in the archives, the motivation behind the circular? Because just a year before that, the first master plan had come out in 1962. So why just a year after that did DDA suddenly decide to take out this whole swath of the urban space from this planning, given that their first plan was essentially an attempt at some sort of ordering of the city?
Should I collect a few questions or should I take them one by one?
Sushmita, we can collect. That's what I was looking through and seeing which were perhaps So I think these Neha Lal seems to have left, but I think some of what she's asking in the chat window, and I can read it out, is maybe related somewhat to what Manish is saying. She's talking about, so she has two questions. One is issues of the record within this thriving rental economy, legacy records, ROR, and the in between, and how it's managed while the destiny of power of attorney keeps flipping and remaining contentious. Do these things differ a lot in villages where Chakbandi was done versus those where it wasn't implemented? So that's one question. And maybe we can come back to the second question later because she's talking more about the future. So maybe these two first.
Right. So yes, Manish, thanks for that question. So I could not particularly find any specific motivations for the 1963 circular, but some of it is probably quite apparent in the master plan document itself. So if you read the sections on the urban village part of the master plan 1962, it is very clear that they were sort of clueless about what to do with these villages. They had literally no idea. So they had some imagination that these villages will continue to, remain village-like. So they would continue to have very village-like arts and crafts kind of things. They'll continue to do pottery. They'll continue to, do these little small artisan-like work, and they will have this relationship with each other, and there will be like a larger concentric circle of villages by which the villages depend on each other. But when you were reading it, you're clear, you are, and there is not much said about it. It's actually not even in the master plan document. It's actually in the working draft of the master plan. In fact, in the master plan, there is not much said about the villages, but the working draft of the master plan does have a lot of these very fanciful ideas of how villages of Delhi would actually continue to exist in the middle of the city. But there was no clear plan as such. So I think, and this is just hunch, I haven't found any administrative record which would sort of clarify this hunch, is that their plans of making Delhi was and rebuilding Delhi. This is also the time when a lot of construction, a lot of work is happening in Delhi, and the state is looking at the new India with these big goggle eyes. They, in this megalomania of plan making, they have no space for how to look at these villages. So I think these 1963 circular, it comes in just as a way of resting a lot of clamor or a lot of confusions that were happening in these villages. So this just comes as, okay, you do what you please, and we'll focus on more quote unquote important things, right? And in 50, 60 years, you see how that circular has had a very different kind of a life. And it's now the state which wants to say that let's get rid of the 1963 exemption. About Chakbandi, yes. So there is Chakbandi is a way in which these property titles were sort of mapped out more clearly in particular villages. The villages that I'm talking about, these land titles were not clearly mapped out. But when land acquisition took place later in 80s and 90s, they had more clear plans of creating very specific land titles and so on and so forth. So that's called Chakbandi. But I don't think, as in, yes, I'm sure that these places where Chakbandi has happened and villages where Chakbandi hasn't happened. They have very different trajectories. But I haven't studied a village where Chakbandi has happened and how the micropolitics of those places work. But
I'm just explain what Chakbandi is for everything else, because I think they may not get the context.
So Chakbandi means it's a what say in these villages happened is that the entire village residential area was given one khasra number. Khasra number is one property title, right? So which is to say that this entire village is therefore one property title. So what is happening is that inside there is very little clarity as to who owns what. So it's all customarily ensured, right, as to property titles, as to which land belongs to which person, is all managed by the community, right? In Chakbandi, that did not. So there was a proper consolidation of land happened, and then there were proper property titles that were sort of laid out. So as a result, there are more clearer property titles. So what I'm speaking about is a situation where property titles are not clear. I'm not sure as to how it pans out in Chakbandi villages where this kind of titling has happened, but I'm sure at the same time some of these concerns that I'm talking about would also map onto the Chakbandi villages as well, because those community structures still do manage to exist.
Thanks, Sushmita. I was thinking that maybe the related questions to these would be from Manas and Pushpa. So I've opened it. Maybe Pushpa, if you can speak, sort of express your question first, and then Manas can come in, because they're sort of talking about this idea of property and, the idea of authorized, unauthorized, and property. So Pushpa, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Mukta. Sushmita, thank you very much. Very fascinating study you have done. I have two questions relating to authorized, unauthorized properties in these urban villages that you have studied. So pre-1983, under the 1962 master plan, there was no planning norms and building bylaws for urban villages.
Right.
So in that environment, what would be identified as an unauthorized construction that needed demolition? So could you please explain that? And then I will go on to the second question.
Right. So here it would, so since I've only looked at these two villages, I can tell you what, how property at this time as in was understood as unauthorized and illegal.
Right.
So what happened in Munirka specifically was that the Dalits of the village were settled on the common property, on the common lands of the village, Shamladde as they call it, and there was no clear owners of that land. So this was historically a lot of these of Dalits were settled on the common property by common consensus in the village, right? And they continue to live on those village common lands. But on administrative records, they were Shamlat land, they were Gaon Sabha land. Then what happened is when the properties, as in land acquisition, happened, the Shamlat property automatically becomes, because there are no clear property, it automatically goes to the state, right? Because there are no clear owners of this. And there is, quote unquote, there's also no compensation. So there is a lot of gripe there as well, saying that we did not get compensation money for our Shamladde, which is our communally owned land. But what it led to is that it automatically in one stroke declared that all these this entire locality which had come in place, which is inhabited by Dalits, is therefore unauthorized construction. So as a result, many of these properties still continue to hold the status of unauthorized, right? And there are similar ways. So, for example, there was even in the other catchment areas of the village, which was not necessarily, as in which was acquired by the state, right, in the 1960s, when these lands were acquired, right? But what happened is that because the state did not construct or did not do anything with these lands, and they were lying fallow, what automatically people did is what they constructed on those quote unquote empty land, right? So as a result, today those properties, as in those, they are on records, on state records, they are state properties. They're owned by, say, you would see CPWD written, or you would see a particular Sarkar Daulatdar, that's another term for the state. But in terms of the possessor, it is someone else, right? Because that property has been, it's a state property which has been encroached and now almost sort of been formalized as say someone else's property. So that is the nature. So this is how, say, the story of urban villages and unauthorized property sort of begin to merge at a particular point, right, where they sort of begin to overlap very, very closely to each other.
Okay, thank you. That was very useful, because it wasn't clear at all.
Can we get Manas to put in this question, because he's also talking about a similar issue,
Okay,
and then come back to you later, because
Okay,
it's just a related question. Manas, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
I think my question was primarily related to the issue of precarity, and it's, I mean, talking about affect and talking about these feelings that urban villagers tend to hold on to. And there I want to make this sort of distinction between urban villages and unauthorized colonies, specifically the sense of precarity that comes from tenure versus outright ownership, or land use violations versus building bylaw violations. And so the nuance of what lends itself to the precarity that one feels is sort of, to me, very crucial here. And so that's why I'm curious about drawing constant comparisons between how unauthorized colonies might feel versus how urban villages might feel with regards to demolition drives, with regards to risk from state, and things like that. So that's basically my question.
Thanks, Manas. So that's a very useful question and an important one at that. What I'm trying to argue in my work is that this precarity of quote unquote on having unauthorized property and not having tenure as such, and not having very clear titles. What I'm saying is that this insecurity that is often produced by this kind of a situation, by this kind of a lack of clear titling, I'm saying this is sort of obfuscated in a situation where there are very clear community institutions which have made sure, which have all kinds of collusions with the state institutions, which have made sure that actually no proper demolition will take place on whatever. So which is why I said that probably one major demolition drive that took place was in 1985. After that, there have been no drives as such. There are individuated demolitions here and there where, say, and they often happen because of, say, someone complaining. Neighbors complained, and then the MCD is then compelled to quote unquote demolish. But what they do is they do some minor breaking here and there, which can immediately be repaired. So that is, and that happens because these community structures, which have also sort of very sort of seamlessly woven into the state structures, especially the lower bureaucracy, including Delhi police, including your MCD, including also the state legislature at many points, that this sort of precarity is sort of tamed. But the kind of precarity that happens is, I think it is now that I'm seeing a certain kind of a precarity that is becoming more and more evident, especially with COVID, right? So here what's happening is that for the longest time, you see rent as more or less a risk-free business. That's what I'm talking about. So you always have, it's a seller's market. You always have more people who want your house than you have actually, right? So you can claim it, you can call the shots in this particular business, right? But what's happening now, especially with COVID, especially migrants going back home, especially not finding enough takers, you see precarity in very different light, right? And I think a lot of precarity is coming to light right now. Also, there is a lot of precarity that we also need to differentiate between who are the landlords. So of course, there are rich landlords, rich Jat landlords. There are poor Jat landlords. There are also uh, sort of middling Dalit landlords as well, right? And all of them have a very different experience of precarity depending on the kind of infrastructure that they have been able to build for themselves. I don't know, this is, you may remember this, early 2020, right before the pandemic hit, a building in Munirka, it's 8 floors tall, it sort of collapsed. And it created quite a bit of furor. So these kinds of incidents reveal a very different kind of precarity that comes in with poor infrastructure. And you hear people talking about, oh, there are rats which are eating up the sewage line. There are, and they have completely hollowed out the ground from below. You don't know whether it's true or not, but what it tells you is that there is a lot of sense of precarity, especially with infrastructure.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah. I know, Manas, you've asked a follow-up question in the chat, but maybe Sushmita, do you want to?
Yeah. Not a question, just a clarification. Sorry, I just meant that. So those kinds of things that protect urban villagers are you're saying are absent in unauthorized colonies. Is that?
Exactly. Is that? Yeah. That kind of thick community network is not clearly there in.
So just a comment on that, a lot of unauthorized colonies in urban villages are also imbricated with each other, especially in East Delhi. So we can, Manas, maybe have a totally separate discussion on that at some point. We've done some work in East Delhi, and that's a whole different thing where the unauthorized colony was born out of the land of a particular village, and so there are still forms of control that may exist and stuff like that. So that's a totally different set of things that are happening.
Well, you see that, but I hear here also in South Delhi as well, you see that overlap, which is what I was talking about between unauthorized colonies and villages, where these kind of course, will extend into. I thought you're talking about unauthorized colonies, which are not necessarily related to urban villages.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about categories without a specific spatial location is sort of what I was coming to.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are a bunch of sort of different kind of questions going on. So I think Pushpa's second question was related to demand for higher compensation. So she's saying, is there a demand for higher compensation for land acquisition in retrospect, as is the case in newly developing areas like Gurugram and Greater Noida? So maybe if you could quickly speak to that, because there's a whole set of questions on other kinds of things.
Right. So yeah, so as in they have been continuing, and there are a lot of ongoing cases, and there have been a series of progressive compensation which has also taken place. So yeah, that's I don't know if there are ongoing cases anymore, but definitely those cases until the time I was doing my fieldwork, people had received compensation. So there were cases of that as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to move to I think Chloe's question. Chloe, can you ask? I've just opened up your mic. You can
yes, good afternoon. I was just wondering if you can repeat the numbers for the rent in Shapujat and whether there is a similar pattern in Monica, because if I recall well, in Monica it appears to be a less wealthier area if you look at the buildings, the appearance of the complex. I don't know if the slum part is regulated under the urban villages or whether it's a notified slum. But Monica appear to be, yes, less wealthy. So I don't know if the rent are as big as Shapoorji.
Right. So this is a slightly um, tricky question to answer, precisely because Munirka, the deal about Munirka is that it developed very, very fast. It developed very early because of the ring road. So because of the ring road moving just along it and getting constructed and becoming an arterial road, Munirka came immediately in the throes of urbanization right in 19. In early 60s, there were markets emerging and there were all kinds of commercial businesses taking place. In Shahpur Jat, that wasn't the case. Shahpur Jat is at that time was a little more in the interior. So this is something I talk about in the book largely, is that it did not people were still doing agriculture till the late 70s, till almost people were growing cauliflowers. Apparently, Shahpur Jat cauliflowers were supposedly like award winning or something. That's what I'm told. But it's only in the late 1970s when the Asiad Games Village begins to get constructed. That's when it begins to see rapid transformation. And that's when that the entire garment manufacturing kind of entrepreneurship begins there. The deal about, yes, you're right that Shahpur Jat claims higher rent, but you would see that those are certain pockets, right? Those are especially the outer this ring around Shahpur Jat, which has all these fancy boutiques and so on and so forth, would claim very, very high rent. Munirka would not have those. But what's happened is that Munirka has seen a longer trajectory of wealth and of business and this, right? Whereas in Shahpur Jat, these boutiques have come up only recently. It's only a post 2000 phenomenon. And it's also a very minor section of the village which have been able to make use of those high values. Many villagers still only rent out to these addas, these garment units, right, which is rented out to workers. So the Dharampal person I was talking about, whose haveli, whose older house, is actually meant for he's actually giving it out for rent to these garment manufacturers, right, who are running their small workshops from there. But he also has this board which says, I want to convert this into upmarket property, and I want to give it to a foreigner so that they can spruce it up and so on and so forth. So there is that kind of an aspiration. But till date, I don't think Dharampal has found, I haven't gone back after 2020 February, but I don't think Dharampal has found some fancy white-skinned person take over that property. So yeah, it's a complex question. It's not a very uniform question to answer.
Thanks, Sushmita. Rohit, do you want to
excuse me?
Sorry, yeah, Chloe, you had a
sorry.
follow-up?
But you say 500% increase of rent between 2000 and 2005 for Shahpur Jat overall.
15,000. So it was 10,000 in 2000 in the year 2000, and 10,000 in the year 2000. By 2005, it becomes 25,000. So it's 15,000 jump.
Thank you.
Rohit, you have a question on caste, if you want to come in now.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Pati, my question would be regarding on the historical aspect of things. And was caste playing a role in the state leaving these villages to their own devices? In that sense, is there a socio-political reason behind the state, allowing these urban villages to stay? Because of the Jat community is a dominant caste in northwestern India, and thus that playing a role.
Are we collecting a few, or are we answering them one by one?
We can actually maybe Berenice's question and Partho's question can sort of follow these. Berenice, do you want to ask yours and then Partho yours, because they all seem to relate? to Bernice? You had a question on community? So I'll just read it out. Maybe that'll be easier. So she says, I would like to have more clarity on the notion of community and the manner in which control or claim is community made. Also, how across time, how did it change? And was wondering about the danger of essentializing the community. And Partho sort of takes on that. Partho, do you want to come in and ask? Or I can read it out if you so prefer. Okay, I'll read it out. Because
this is Mariellen. This was my question.
Sorry,
yeah.
Mariellen.
No, it follows on the question on the JAD community. I felt that in the presentation you keep opposing to somehow the state to the community, but that community we don't really know what it is about, how it is governed, how it is politically constituted. You said the whole village stands up, but who is the whole village? And and over time, I guess this would have changed. So I would really have to have a better understanding of your notion of the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, Partho, you weren't audible. We couldn't hear you at all. Do you want me to read out your question? Okay, so he says, so he's again saying that the discussion seems to imply a stable community in that ownership seems not to have changed hands over time. Is that correct? And if not, what are the dynamics between original owners and new owners? So that's the question that relates to these two. He has a separate question on whether you could speak a little more to tenancy arrangements in urban villages, especially commercial tenants. But that's sort of a little bit separate from this community and ownership question. I think
Right.
these together.
Right. So about historicity and sorry, and about the caste question and whether there was any motivation on the state's part, that's very hard to tell. As in it's very hard to get into the intentions of the state, especially when the state is not necessarily discussing it in its documentation, at least as far as I can find. But I don't think it's got more to do with convenience. It's got more to do with what does the state have bandwidth for in 1960s and what the state didn't have bandwidth for. So I think it comes more from that. About the question of community, thanks for asking that, because this is it comes much later in my other chapters, where I'm talking about the evolution of this community as well. So yes, there is an attempt to first let me just talk about the institutions that I talk about. So I talk about how panchayats, right, they sort of become almost a community institution where which becomes sort of cartel-like structure to negotiate the rent market, right? So then these cartels then become the ways in which, say, sometimes even standardized properties are sort of decided, whether how much electricity rates to charge, and they're always way higher than the market rate. These also sort of come to a stabilized understanding because of the presence of the cartel. And in the name of community issues, often what are discussed is landlords issues, right? The second is, of course, I talk about the family, which is a kunba structure. So it's a kunba would be, say, a broader family unit, which roughly, say, spans across 3 generations, right? And so it could range anywhere between 40 people to 100, 150 people. It depends on the kind of family that we're talking about. And what many of these kunbas have done, especially in Chapujat, is that they have pumped in money together into a particular space which communally belongs to that family. And what they have done is, and I'm calling it almost like a vernacular joint stock company. Like joint stock companies are again built on anonymous owners who own stocks and shares. What is happening here, these are not anonymous groups at all. These are largely groups where, these are kunba structures where family members are pooling in money and putting in money to spruce up an entire real estate area, right? And that's happened a lot in Shapujat. About the question of community, yes, as in you're absolutely right in saying that, and many of you are spot on, that this community is not stable. So as much as there is an imagination that, and these it's just discussed and there is it's just the wealthy Jats have been able to do that. What has happened, and that's also happened because of the way in which capital has worked its way, is that several other communities, including Dalits, have also increasingly become landlords. And it has also happened because of the force of capital. So what's happened is that earlier village structures, villages were designed as such that the upper castes and the dominant castes would live in the middle, and it would be the lower caste would live on the outside, on the periphery, right? So that they are protected. When capital comes in, when real estate development happens, when the ring road comes in, it is the peripheral property which gains a lot more value, right? So as a result, there is definitely a strife that happens between the Dalits and the dominant communities. So increasingly, also what has happened is post 2000s. Several Dalits have also been able to become landlords, and they are also now part of these panchayats. So these panchayats can no longer afford to be simply a Jat representation. They also have to take on board the Dalit voices. They also have to take on board Dalit participation. And there are very interesting ways in which the Dalits have been able to circumvent many of the decisions of the panchayat. Especially if you remember, there was a fiat against the northeastern community right after in 2014, that there was a rape case where a northeastern girl gets raped and by a landlord's son, and that immediately leads to attention, and immediately the landlords respond with a fiat saying that we will no longer rent out to northeastern communities. And the primary voices against that kind of a diktat was from Dalit villagers, who said that the rich Jat landlords have the luxury of saying that, oh, we will not rent to these people, but we will still have to rent out to them because I have a housing loan and I have spent so much money on constructing. So I don't have the luxury of doing this. So which is how ultimately that fiat falls through. Similarly, in the Shapur Jat Kunba kind of a structure, several families, right, who may not be related, who may be neighbors, and this is, of course, this is now, it's just not about one family. It could be families who are belonging to different castes, who are now pooling in money similarly, and saying that, okay, now we will pool in money, and we will invest in our stretch of lane, and we will try to hike up our rents as well. So those kinds of challenges and those kinds of conversations are actually happening within this whatever I'm calling community, right? So earlier the idea was to call yourself as Jats. Increasingly now the terminology is moving towards being landlords. Sometimes even long-term tenants have become landlords now. So now people are also talking about gaon wale. So there are all different kinds of terminologies that are used to talk about this affect of being a community, and this community is absolutely not stable. Thank you for those questions.
Sushmita, I think Partho had a second question about tenancy arrangements, especially among commercial tenants.
Right. So what is happening?
New set of questions coming in, so you have to be prepared for that.
So about the commercial tenants, there is something called pagdi, which is a lump sum amount that commercial tenants are expected to pay up front, and then there is, of course, a particular rental arrangement that is done, especially in Shapur Jat, where its tenants who are investing in that property. It is it is understood that the landlords will not necessarily take part in those kinds of upgradations. It is entirely on the tenants to do that. So if that answers that question broadly. Yes, in some senses, yes. Yeah.
Aprajita, do you want to ask your question, and then I can sort of ask. I'll open it out to Shantanu in the meanwhile while you're asking.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. This was really, yeah. Like I knew some, but I also didn't know a lot of the peri-urban areas. I'm interested in scales of governance. Who are the officials who are in touch with the village communities? Is it the DDA authorities? Is it lower rung Delhi authorities, PWD? Like I'm interested in who's talking to them from the state side. That's very much.
Yeah, so in my whatever I understand, so it's mostly the MCD which is the primary institution who they speak to, whether it comes to the question of property, whether it comes to the question of conversion charges. It's been a very, very animated debate in these villages, whether it comes to the question of also waste and infrastructure. So MCD is a very, very prime player. Also, in terms of land titles, it's of course the revenue office. If there are land disputes, then the revenue office becomes very, very central in negotiating some of that.
Are you looking at that? Are you looking at disputes?
Some.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks.
Shantanu, do you want to ask your question on minorities?
Yes, thank you so much, Mukta. So there are several questions actually, but I maybe will stick to this one. In one of the urban villages in East Delhi, I did come across this one point where so the minorities have a reservation in the local constituency. So is this a case also in the urban villages that you surveyed?
What do you mean by minorities here?
May not be of the dominant caste. I'm not very clear, I think, here, but not of the dominant caste of the communities.
Right. And what kind of representation you're talking about here?
Reservations in the, say, the local constituencies.
Okay. In terms of electoral politics, you mean?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So to answer this, yeah. So Shantanu, what's happening here is that in electoral politics, it is often, unless there is a reserved seat, at least in the two villages that I look at, unless say Munita is declared as a women's constituency or a Nessie reserved constituency, you don't see too many either Dalits or women representatives. But what's happening here is that in terms of aspirations, so as what's happening is that as accumulation has grown in these villages, and there are several people who now feel very confident about now taking that plunge and entering into electoral politics. So the last chapter I look at precisely focuses on that kind of an aspiration, which gets very, very evident, especially in local politics, because everybody has enough money to, a lot of people, actually not in everybody, a lot of people have enough money to contest at least the councillor position, or now even the MLA in the legislative assembly seats as well. So increasingly you're seeing more and more people becoming very active in electoral politics, but it is you would see mostly the wealthy Jats who have been able to take that plunge, not so much the Dalits or the women.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Am I allowed to follow up here?
Sure, go ahead.
This is just me thinking out loud and a curious question here. So because given the nature of the property here, it may be a part of the urban village may be not regularized, right? So the way in which the revenue department say collects the taxes will also be different, right? So I at the moment reside in a unauthorized colony, and here the unauthorized part of the colony pays the tax by going to a park, as opposed to the authorized part of the colony wherein the collection happens at the doorstep of the regularized part. Is this a common feature or just?
So, as I would understand it, there is no regularized part as such, right? So there is either a part which is understood as something similar to unauthorized colony, and then there is the Laldor area, which has been historically exempt, but then is now increasingly coming under all kinds of regulations. So even they are now subject to a whole lot of regulations and so on and so forth. But what is happening? So I haven't been able to follow exactly how is taxation money collected. But what it seems to me is that there is a great deal of let's say unevenness in this kind of collection, right? So for example, there could be people who are sort of paying or who pay once in a while. There are people who haven't paid, and there are also different kinds of taxation. So some people don't decide to pay the house tax, but don't decide to pay the conversion charge. So there is a whole lot of a complex way in which people negotiate this thing of what we call taxation. But what I understand is that there is no even way of understanding as to what are people doing. People are doing really very, very different negotiations in order to keep their claim up, but also at the same time not be entirely burdened by the tax regime.
Okay, thank you so much. Just the last thing, sorry, I promise. Is there some kind of resentment, would you say, because of this, between the long-term residents and the new residents? Who may be paying of the locality. In the Lal Dora, for instance, as you're saying, people pay, I mean, their structure of ownership and payment of taxes and political entitlements are a bit more structured, and as opposed to those residents who are not part of the Lal Dora and unauthorized.
Yeah, not really. I didn't particularly see anything of that kind that you're talking about.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sushmita. I actually had a question of my own, which was somewhere, which sort of pertains to this. You're talking about resisting this formalization or regularization kind of change, but then there is this idea of regeneration that this new draft master plan is bringing in. So, and there is also an intergenerational, I'm assuming, change within these communities. So I'm wondering whether there are not dominant but new voices among these village communities that have started arguing that there could potentially be gains if regeneration or redevelopment were formally permitted. Is that kind of conversation now beginning to happen? So that's my question. And a related question that Neha had was this question of land pooling and the future of urban villages as DDA looks to sort of extract land value. And the way she phrases it is, how does the future of urban villages look like as DDA wishes to push the land pooling scheme for extracting land urban villages as hubs of affordable housing, even while urban villages continue to service this demand in the capital informally? And how do different communities stand with regard to such opportunities? So, I mean, we're asking the same question in different ways, basically.
Right, thanks for that question. And I don't have answers for this, actually. This is because when I was doing my field work, I did not clearly see any particular enthusiasm around regularization. In fact, there was when Sheila Dikshit, around her time, when she had said that, okay, villages can apply for regularization and we'll see to it. It wasn't really responded to with a lot of enthusiasm, right? Some people started an effort, but then it sort of lost its way, and then people sort of forgot about it. Next year I came back and I asked them what happened to that application. They were like, oh yeah, we totally forgot about it. So there is a certain kind of, well, as in, like I said, it's not like, I think there is also a lot of ambivalence around it, let's say, if not suspicion, amongst a lot of people as to whether it'll bring in any good or whether it'll not. They are not entirely sure. And with some people, it's just suspicion, right? Where they think that it's just, what is this about? And it's not going to do us any good. What's happening with NPD 2020, this 2041, I'm not sure, because I haven't been able to go back. It would have been interesting to see if there are conversations happening. But I would be surprised if there were any conversations on this. I would be frankly surprised. In terms of future, well, again, this land pooling is again a very, very interesting a new method of quote unquote land acquisition that we're talking about, right? So in the 1950s, the state decided to create these exceptional spaces, these urban villages. Now we're talking about something like land pooling, and what it will lead to, I don't think it would not be similar to what we are talking about. It will be they will still be villages, but their contestations and their issues and their problems would be entirely different, because this is in Delhi's history, this would be the fourth massive, let's say, or actually fourth would be wrong. Actually, it's been almost progressive. It's not actually, it will be wrong to put a number to it. But increasingly, you see that the regime, the way in which land acquisition, the pattern itself the technology has changed. And what it is going to lead to, I would totally understand if people are very anxious about what does land pooling really mean, and what kind of new social relationships it will lead to. But yeah, I'm yet to follow any of these land pooling exercises and how that happens.
That's right. I mean, at least in the conversations, one sees a lot of anxiety because it's a new set of actors that the villagers now have to deal with. They have to deal with corporates, larger developers, factory, industrial owners who've already acquired land. So it's a whole new world for them to negotiate. And what I'm hearing largely is that they don't know. They don't have the wherewithal to negotiate, which is really reminiscent of what happened in the 50s and
Absolutely
60s in your villages, because at that time they didn't have the wherewithal to negotiate the forces that were of transformation at that point of time. So it's almost like it's a totally different landscape, but it's also history repeating itself in some ways. So yeah, I mean, are there any more questions? If somebody wants to raise hands or just jump in, put something on the chat box. I don't see any new questions as such. Does anybody from the group? Oh, Partho. Yes, Partho, go ahead.
I think he has a question below as well as in the.
Yeah. Pardon?
I think it's a question which is typed in the chat box.
So he, as the community involves, does its ability to mitigate risk by cohesively resisting demolition decline? So that's one question that he has typed.
So the answer to this question is actually no, because the way in which they have been able to negotiate their way into the political and institutional structures, that still remains intact, right? So even if, say, Dalits have not been able to get a post in, say, Delhi police or so, it doesn't matter, because there are other people from the community who are, as in who are in that institution, and at that time they act as landlords, not necessarily as so, which is why I'm also talking of them as a cartel, because a cartel allows you to manage a resource like, say, something like oil cohesively together, but at the same time maintain your separate interests. So to a great deal, despite the fact that this cartel has been sort of ruptured by other communities, but that does not mean that the power of cartel has come down at any point. Yeah.
So it's an internal external kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
Okay, I think Partho had a follow on from Shantanu's question about elections, which he wrote to me separately, saying, are some of the councillor positions reserved by rotation, and then how does that reservation story play out? Do you look at this at any point of time?
Yes, I do. So that's the elections is basically the last grand finale of the book, where so with women's reservations, it's precisely what we see everywhere else, whereas that the husbands and the father-in-laws prop up their these women from the families, and they continue to be on the face, but their husbands are also on these election posters and everywhere, so you know them as
Pati.
yes, so that happens. But there are also women who are who get elected, but at the same time are very, very vocal, are very, very invested in what's happening in localities. They are seen everywhere. So not all of them are necessarily silent or just puppets. The other is, of course, with the SC/ST reservation. Same thing happens. Sometimes what happens is that the local wealthy landlords, they pull in money and they say, okay, this person, why don't you stand from the Dalit caste? And then that particular election is funded by them. And ultimately, there is that sense of loyalty has to sort of trickle down into these dominant structures. So that's what has happened is this, that in terms of economically, the Dalits have been able to crack open these cartels and these joint stock company kind of formations, but politically they are still far away from doing that. Politically, these offices and these positions of power are still held by the richer Jats, not even any Jats, so who have been historically rich for a while. So there is a lot of that happening at every level.
Thanks, Sushmita. Prajita, you had one last question, and maybe after that we can start.
Yes, we wrap up. I want to keep it short, but this is just way out of your book, and I was reminded of this incident that happened recently, where the Shapurja, the Sai Baba Temple people came in, broke the whole idol and replaced it with Ganesh or something. I'm wondering if you have any comment on that, and what does it show about the actual village space, and what's happening to it?
So that this is a longer trajectory which has happened to Delhi villages overall. So if you the Nonika Datta has a great book on the history of the Jat community, and they say, and what she argues is that there were actually very syncretic traditions with very mixed Hindu-Muslim kind of ideas. They also have their own gods, but over a period of time, what you see is that especially with Arya Samaj movement in early 1920s, they increasingly come into the Hindu fold. They increasingly begin to imagine, think of themselves as a Hindu community, and they're brought into the fold through the Arya Samaj movement. So then they turn vegetarians and so on and so forth. All that. So Nonika Datta's work is actually fantastic. I
was wondering more about the space which allowed such a violence to happen. It was sort of shushed down, and like it was like in a way not to affect the boutiques, not to affect the overall monetization in that sense, the space itself.
Well, so that is something that you would see with a lot of violence in these places, whether it was a Shiv Mandir thing, or say beating up of say a northeastern person, or say especially in Shapur Jat, like, which is they are very quickly shut down. They're very quickly sort of curbed down, and nobody talks about it eventually, because there are a lot of fires happening in Shapur Jat because it's a garment factory. You will never hear of them because they are that quickly they're sort of shushed, and that's because of they have to keep up that appearance. They have to keep up that everything is normal, everything is fine, and that is so ingrained into that space, because if you go to a normal industrial area, if you go to say one of those I'm forgetting the names of those, not Jahangirpuri industrial area. It has a very different vibe to it. There is smoke, there are people, there are workers, there is always a tension in that air. In Shapur Jat, it's almost as if the workers don't exist. The only thing that you hear is the clanking of sewing machines, and maybe some Bengali folk song which is playing, which is blaring in the background. But there is no sign of a labor unrest. There is no, it's almost like there's nothing happening in terms of labor unrest. But what is, but I have my doubts, right? In the sense that whether those labor unrest doesn't entirely exist. But the landlords are very, very cued into the management, not just of the space, but also of these workshops, also of the disciplining of these workers, that there is no one who's able to, create any kind of quote unquote trouble.
Right. This is very similar to Kapaseda, which I look at.
Yeah.
Very similar vibe. Except that it's in the middle of South Delhi, which is far more prosperous. All right. I think, I mean, Partho has a comment for all of us, for you, Sushmita, which you can look at, but it's not a question. So, he wants to know whether the workers stay in the village.
Yes, they do. They stay in the same unit. So where the manufacturing takes place, they often work on these addas, which are these large frames. At night, what they do is they lift up those large frames, they prop it against the wall, they roll down their mattresses. There is the small cooking utensils. They cook their food. So they live and stay in and work in the same unit. Yeah, absolutely. So when I was doing my fieldwork, I didn't. They were not reserved seats, so I didn't have a very clear understanding of what's happening, or whether there is anything more than token representation. Yes, but at least in terms of at least SC/ST representation, I did not, as in they were not reserved at that point, so I didn't see that. But it will be something interesting to look at, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sushmita, and not just for the talk, which was fantastic, but also for, engaging deeply with questions that ranged from, sociological questions to really land tenure and legal questions. So clearly something that people who are here today are already quite, thinking a lot about these kinds of spaces and these kinds of questions. So I hope you also enjoyed the feedback that came your way, and looking forward to the book. When is it out?
Hopefully 6 months, if nothing goes wrong, if third wave doesn't hit, which it will. So yeah, it depends on a lot of things that we can't control.
Sure, but soon, within the year, definitely. Okay. Thank you so much. We look forward.
Thank you so much. This is entirely my pleasure. I had a great time. Thank you for sticking around for so long and listening to me ramble on.
Bye, everyone, and see you next month.
Thank you so much. Bye.